Hello everyone, it's Martin Anders Shalazine, and with Masters Copenhagen now, well, like 24 hours away, I wanted to push this video out. I know we've all been bombarded with Masters content already, be it high-level agent statistics or looking at the micro or set plays of the specific teams, but I wanted to do something a little bit different. We're going to be taking a look at the global metagame compositionally leading up to this event, how the Copenhagen teams sort of slot in and outside of that, and how everything may interact. Let's jump right into it. In the interest of keeping this fairly concise, I'm not going to dive too much into the statistics. Obviously, I will have them up on the screen, so feel free to pause and take a look at them yourself, but I will mostly be glossing over them, just laying out the comps instead, and then diving more into how the Copenhagen teams sort of fit into this metagame and the dynamics that I expect to see come out of that as a result. Kicking things off with Ascent, we have what I would refer to as one of the more solved metagames, in that there's a very high concentration of comp at the top of the food chain. We have what is essentially Ascent standard, making up a little bit over a third of the metagame, with Jet, KO, Killjoy, Sova, and a controller. That said, though, we don't see any Brimstone or Viper, it's just Omen and Astra, and the Omen subsection of that third is significantly larger, coming in at almost 28%. It comes in at that rate with good reason as well, it's the vastly higher performing out of the two. Going into the second slot, we have what is effectively standard with Fade rather than Sova. It outperforms the standard comp by a fairly high margin, but again, it's going to be working off of a much smaller sample, so that can be subject to quite a bit of variance. Below that, we have the newly in vogue Raise Chamber Fade setup. Below that, we have the standard composition again, but with a Chamber rather than a Killjoy. Pausing here for a moment, I wanted to mention that with Chamber's stock at an all-time high in terms of public perception, it's worth pointing out here that bringing him in over the Killjoy is actually significantly underperforming. We're talking about a net 3% negative delta in the compositional win rate here, and it just goes to show that Chamber, while definitely a strong pick, in this sort of specific scenario where you're bringing it into a composition where it doubles up on that opping role with the Jet, isn't actually valuable. In my opinion, Chamber as an agent isn't necessarily overtly powerful. It's what he allows you to do compositionally that actually makes him good. And so in instances like this, where you're not really using him slotting into the composition to allow you to sort of fish for higher utility value elsewhere in the comp, it's just going to fall flat. Going below that, we start hitting really the dregs of the lower play rate compositions. We have a full flashless comp that's bringing in Sage instead of KO. We have a triple duelist comp going no duelist, excepting maybe the Chamber if you consider him that way. And last, we have what is functionally a battle Sage comp where you're bringing in the Sage instead of the duelist. If we pivot over to how the Copenhagen competitors sort of slot into this Ascent meta, we see that for the most part, it's aligned. We have a handful of teams playing that standard Omen composition in Guild, Loud, and Xset, and then we also have DRX, Xerxia, Fnatic, Crew, and PaperRex also filling out compositions that are amongst those top 3 most played. This is really a great highlight of why I formatted the video the way that I did, and really the conclusions that I'm hoping we'll be able to draw from it, in that we can look at this global Ascent metagame and say, okay, the Copenhagen competitors are going to more or less line up precisely with it, excluding this small subsection of teams that are going to be coming in with very much so dark horse compositions. You look at that top end of the pack and okay, the teams are going to have played against these styles before, they'll have built-in protocols for these compositions, they'll understand the majority of the set plays that are available to these compositions, but then you go outside of the list and it's okay, these are now teams that are playing something fairly significantly off meta that are going to demand very specific prep from the other teams. If I'm playing against FPX on Ascent, I know that I can't just use a blanket prep against them. They're going to be playing something that is very much so a non-standard Ascent. Speaking of off-meta, we have this one major outlier in North Eption where the composition that they run doesn't even register on that top list. It's a dual Sentinel setup where they're running both the Chamber and the Killjoy. With the incredibly limited sample of this comp being more or less just North Eption, we can't really draw conclusions from the statistics here, but again, it's an instance of, if you're playing against this team, good luck having your protocols apply. It's going to be a very atypical playstyle to what you're used to. Moving over to Bind, we have a much less concentrated metagame, the top comp taking not even a fifth, even including variations of the same comp. That being Brimstone, Chamber, Raise, Sky, Viper, something that I think we would all more or less recognize as the go-to composition in Bind over the last couple of weeks. Following a pretty acute drop-off of nearly 10 full percentage points in terms of meta share, we have the same comp but bringing in Fade over that Viper. Then across the next two, we have the only no Chamber comps on the list, one bringing in Sage instead of Chamber, on that most common composition, and the other one being really an amalgam of the first and the second, where they drop the Chamber, instead favoring to have both the Fade and the Viper. Going past that point, we really just have 4 different iterations of the same composition, with Brimstone Chamber, Duelist, Double Initiator, the Initiators being the primary point of juggling, and only one of the compositions opting for Neon over the Rays in that Duelist slot. Panning over to the Copenhagen teams, we see that it is incredibly concentrated, with half of all of the teams there effectively playing the top comp. The only minor footnote being that Fnatic runs an Astra over the Brimstone. We've got Guild, Loud, and Northeption playing increasingly less meta comps, and we've actually got 3 teams this time that are completely off radar. Similar to with Northeption, do not read into these statistics, they're absolute bullshit that rely on astronomically small samples, but we can look at the compositions and see just how far off the beaten path they are. FPX boasting the only KO amongst any of the compositions that we've seen on the list, also bringing in Cypher. Optic playing some mid-range Nightmare Fuel with double Flash Initiator Neon Astra, and Paper Rex with the "we all knew it was coming" Forsaken Yoru. Way more than on Ascent, these highlight just how far off course you're going to get with some of these comps, and in some of these cases so much so that honestly, if I were one of the teams in Copenhagen prepping against one of these opponents, I'm probably heavily VOD reviewing and literally building entire tailor-built setups to counter how egregiously abnormal they are. A low-hanging fruit example being if I'm playing against FPX, I'm probably defaulting my Viper completely differently than I would against a normal comp. I'm not going to put myself or my players in a situation where our bottleneck denial is getting knifed every single exec, and that's a circumstance that I only have to worry about when I'm playing against FPX. Further, it's something that I may have 0 domestic experience against. It's these kinds of wildcards that I think are going to cause a really intriguing dynamic in map bans when we start looking into this competition tomorrow. Moving over to Breeze, we have another one of the more concentrated map-specific metas, and that's because at the top slot we have something that takes up literally half of all comps, with Chamber, Jet, a Flash Initiator, a Sova, and a Viper. Now, I kind of bullshitted this one, just a little bit, because I included Reyna as a Flash Initiator. Let's be honest with ourselves, in terms of her functional role on this map, that's what she is. If you think otherwise, you're lying to yourself a little bit. I don't know how else to put it. Below that, we have a comp which is, frankly, a little bit of a comp of times gone past, which is the Cypher variation of that first comp running a KO. And then, surprisingly, near the top of the list, at least based off of my expectations, we have a Chamber Neon KO Sova Viper variation, the Phase comp, as I've come to refer to it. After that, we have the Sky version of that old school comp, a Triple Initiator No Duelist setup, a Yoru version of the Phase comp, and to round it out, we have a sole example of a double controller comp, this one bringing an Omen to that Duelist flex slot that seems to be leveraged by most of these setups. Similar to Bind, we've got 6 teams that are really concentrated towards that upper echelon, the most common compositions in Crew, Loud, Optic, Northeption, Paper Rex, and Xerxia, all being in that really standardized format. The one sort of exception is that Xerxia runs double Flash Initiator. They bring in Sky and KO instead of the Sova in that top most played comp. And then we have the rest interspersed down the list. We've got Exit and Guild opting for Cypher options, DRX and Leviathan going for that Triple Initiator, FPX bringing the Yoru in. Lastly, we have one massive outlier, and that's Fnatic, because, well, they literally don't have a comp. They don't play the map, and so what they're going to bring is a complete mystery. Gun to my head, if I had to absolutely guess what they were going to play, I would assume that it's probably just that topmost comp, the Chamber Jet KO Sova Viper. You keep Durka on the Chamber, you put Alpha on Jet, and you just go with it. However, knowing Fnatic, I don't know if the most obvious choice is what they would ultimately end up doing. I would personally love, and I mean love, to see them run something like the Phase comp. I think that their team dynamics would actually suit it super well. We've seen that Alpha can find high degrees of success on Rays, and so putting him on something that's pretty high individual agency like a Neon, holy moly, boy would feast. That would be so exciting to me, but we'll have to wait and see if Fnatic even lets it through map bans. Splitting over to Fracture, the compositional meta is one of the most linear. You've got Breach, a Controller overwhelmingly Brimstone, a Sentinel overwhelmingly Chamber, XX. At the top, we have the Optic pioneered KO Neon, highly aggressive, ultra fast-paced version. Below that, we have the more denial-focused Sage Raze setup that was mostly pioneered by Mech/Gambit. You have the Cypher variation of the same comp directly below it, and tied for that slot, you actually have the cross-section of the two with a Sage Neon, a double duelist directly thereafter, a Raze variation of the top comp, and then you hit the Viper variations. Fracture is actually one of the maps that excites me the most, because as you can see when we look at the Copenhagen competitors, it is an extremely, extremely diverse spread. We've got some KO Neon supported duelist, we've got some Sage Raze stall, we've got some Sage Neon hybrid, we've got double duelist, we've got Viper. It is across the board, we've got a little bit of everything. Because of that, I think Fracture is actually going to be one of the hardest to prep maps at this event, because you're going to have to play the map 5 different ways depending on who you're playing on the day. Heading over to Haven, we have what is literally the least concentrated compositional metagame of any map in the pool. The top pick garnering barely over 7%. And while at first I was going to try and aggregate this into a couple different archetypes, it just is a constant jumble between initiators without flashes, initiators with flashes, different duelists, different controllers. You would almost have to make different archetypes for 6 different things, and at that point, just say what the actual comps are. The one constant that we do have across all of these is a Breach and a Sentinel. From the top, we have Breach, Chamber, Fade, Omen, Raze, something that on its face seems quite strong, but when you think about it a little bit more logically in terms of synergies, it's a bit surprising. Omen obviously has been a staple on Haven as long as the game has been out, but when you start diving into that Breach, Fade, Raze in particular, there's not much synergy when you're looking at Omen. There really isn't. I mean, you can talk about Seize Paranoia combos, you can talk about Breach stuns into Paranoias, but on the all, I would imagine that Astra is always going to be consistently better. You have Suck Stun combos, you have Suck Nade combos, you have Seize Suck combos, all of these synergies that have far more layers than a Paranoia and come at a much lower cost and more flexibility. And we see that sort of come into play where if you go second from the bottom, we have the Astra variation of this comp, and it has an almost 10% higher win rate despite being a significantly lower sample, so there is an asterisk there. But just on a purely logical basis, I'm a little bit surprised that the variation with Omen is so pronouncedly more played. Moving down the list, we start seeing things juggled around a little bit. We see a Skye come in for the Fade to bring in auxiliary flashes. We see a Jet come in for the Raze. And then we see even the Sentinel mixed up a little bit, swapping in a Killjoy for the Chamber, bringing in a Sova rather than that Fade or Skye, but keeping the Jet, etc., etc. The standout elements for me on this list are really isolated to 3 things, the first of which being that one I just mentioned, with that Astra Fade Raze comp really punching incredibly heavily, and something that I want to keep an eye on at this event to see if it holds against the absolute best of the best. We see another Astra composition that is sort of a more classical styled Haven, not even bringing in the Chamber, and that is also performing at an incredibly high level. The last one is sort of a full throttle comp. It's that Neon double flash initiator with the Breach and the Skye. It's just a heavily flash supported single duelist. I think for those of you that have been sticking around my content for a long time, we've seen a very interesting meta evolution, because it was for a long time that you had sort of that Astra Killjoy Viper, very entrenchment-focused meta, and we still have a couple of those compositions holding over, as we can see here. Those are then sort of complemented by this new age Chamber Fade Raze setup that's a lot more mid-range centric. It focuses on mid-round informational tools through boom bots and prowlers. And then you've got sort of that last point to the triangle in these Neon comps where it's, we have a ton of flash support, and we're just literally going to sprint at you. It is epitomizing holding W to the nth degree. And while I'd be lying if I said that I thought the 3 archetypes were well balanced in their current states, I think the fact that we at least have clear visibility of those 3 distinct archetypes appearing across multiple maps is a generally healthy indicator. Focusing a little bit more back on the topic at hand, will we see those 3 archetypes well represented in Copenhagen across the board? And the answer is, well, yes and no. We've got 2 of the 3 very well represented. We've got Chamber Fade Raze in spades, and we've got sort of a more traditional style entrenchment comp well represented as well. What we are, however, missing is that really breakneck pace composition. That is, at least, until we pivot over to the black sheep of the group. Here we see that Optic is the sole standard bearer of that archetype. Paper Rex in typical Paper Rex fashion is just completely doing their own thing. You've got Jet Reyna with Benkai Cypher. It's cracked, it works for them, but my word, is it completely different from what everyone else is bringing at the moment. Second to last, we've got Icebox, where sort of old debates have taken on new life. It's no longer a question of whether or not you're running a traditional Sentinel on this map, it's more a question of are you running 2 of them. We've got that typical Sage Sova Viper core across the overwhelming majority of these comps, and then we've got Chamber across most of them as well. It's really that 4th and final slot that really sees any flex, whether it be a Duelist in a Jet Razor Reyna, or that 2nd Sentinel I mentioned in a Killjoy, or an Initiator in a KO. Towards the outer edges of pick rate, we also see that teams are still experimenting with Sageless on this map, and actually are starting to find fairly significant success. If I were to hazard a guess as to why these are having newfound success, it's going to be the increase in ubiquity of Sentinels. Historically, you're relying a lot on slow orbs and barrier orbs on your defensive side to allow for stall. In situations where you were often looking at long flanks, you really needed to be able to buy extra time, and now where Sentinels have really become standard hat, you've got a trademark that can either provide that on-site stall or at least allow for mid-map coverage that allows that person to rotate sooner. And so, because of that now being the case, you get to reallocate a little bit of your compositional power budget for something that's more proactive. We see a KO coming in, and it really sort of epitomizes that proactivity. You've got flashes, obviously, that allow you to now take more initiative on both sides of the map, as well as your 0 points that open up completely new avenues of control where you can deny Aldrones that many teams rely on in almost exclusivity to take space on their attack sides. Looking at the Copenhagen competitors, interestingly, not a single team is running the most played composition. The closest that we get is Paper Rex, but even they're swapping out the Sova for a Fade. What we do have is a large contingent of teams, specifically the South American representatives, who are leaning into that KO composition. Beyond that, we've got some European teams who are leaning into the double Sentinel, Guild with a bit of a throwback Reyna comp, Xerxia with the OG Killjoy comp for the map, and North Eption coming in with a Sageless KO. Panning over, we do have one extreme outlier in Optic, Chamber Brimstone KO Fade Viper, no Duelist, Sageless double controller. Yeah, that's a comp, I guess. And while I joke, it's actually kind of cracked. When you think about it intuitively, this comp has an insane amount of tools. If you go off of the logic that I was just using about Sageless compositions and proactivity, it fits that build to a T and even has supplemental value in the fact that it's bringing a Fade and can't be affected by other teams that are running KO. And as a kicker, good luck finding footage and prepping. No one plays this shit. Last but not least, we finally land on Split, which has a fairly high concentration for a single comp, but then immediately breaks down to an extremely sparse spread. With just about a fifth of the metagame, we have Breach, Omen, Raze, Sage, Traditional Sentinel. The Cypher version of the comp vastly outperforming the Chamber one. From there, the comps start juggling fairly aggressively. You've got Breach coming in and out for Skye, the Sage coming in and out, Viper coming in both as a Sentinel and not as a Sentinel. You've got the Raze being swapped out for Jet and Neons even. If we look at performance, the standard composition with Cypher is really just the best comp there is, with one exception, and that's the unsupported double dive setup. Which brings me to another point. Where is supported double dive? There's no Breach Jet Raze comp on here. It's literally just not on the list. Historically, that was amongst the top 3 most played compositions on this map, and we're at a point now where it doesn't even make the top 8. When we switch over to the Copenhagen competitors, you're probably just going to sit there scratching your head, because there's literally only 5 teams here. That's because once you break out of that top 8, the remaining compositional meta is so evenly spread that literally more than half of the competitors at Copenhagen are running comps that would fall outside of that top 8. This map is incredibly hard to prep. You're talking about compositions where it's going to be hard to find domestic analogs because there's so much variability that everything is very much so unto itself. And to make matters worse, Split just got removed from the rotation. So were you going to find scrims on this map anyway? I wouldn't be surprised if there's an extreme skew in the way that teams are map banning. If you're a really good Split team, you're just going to want to windmill slam it whenever you possibly can. If you're a bad Split team, you're going to avoid it like the plague. We're talking a situation where if it was not a good map for you, it's just your auto ban. It'll be really interesting to see what happens for teams with historically strong Split like Loud and Xset, because my bet would be that they're just going to force a Split permaban against them for the entire duration of the event. To close things up, this was just a quick overview of the global metagame, and then me essentially just mashing the Copenhagen competitors on top to see how much of a reflection of the global meta this event is going to be. More importantly, though, I want to sort of re-highlight the fact that the whole reason I did this wasn't to see how much of an analog it is, but to see where the outliers are, and by extension, who is going to throw the biggest wrench in the works in terms of delivering compositions that are going to require very specific prep. We've got FPX, we've got North Eption, we've got Optic, and we've got Paper Rex, who are head and shoulders above the rest in terms of how outside of the norm their compositions are. I think that you're going to look at other teams that are favorites in this event, like Fnatic, and be like, oh, when you really look at it, it's not necessarily that they have very distinct compositional edges, it's that they're playing a standard meta to a level that other teams simply cannot match. And so it will be interesting to see the interactions that we get between teams like that who are playing a more standardized meta, really at the peak of efficiency, versus these teams like Optic that are really just coming completely out of left field, applying pace and tempo that really isn't matched by any other team, and see how it's received on either end. Unfortunately, no co-stream permissions for me this time around, but you can follow me on Twitter at AndersTV, where I'll live tweet most of the games, and if I happen to invade a co-stream as a guest, that will be the first place to find out. Hopefully you enjoy the event as much as I'm sure I will over the next couple of weeks, and this video has put you in a position to keep a little bit of a closer eye on the compositional aberrations and off-meta setups that a couple of these teams are going to bring, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into why you think they're picking them and the edge it may give them in this event. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.